Good afternoon. Welcome to the Hearing Aid Dispensers Committee meeting. Very excited that it's actually in person. Let's call to order and have the roll call. Marcia Raggio.
Here.
Karen Chang.
Here.
Amy White.
Here.
And Committee Chair Todd Borges here. We also have a public location, Gelleris Family Education Center. Gilda, are you with us?
Here, I am.
Could you identify your location and address and whether or not any members of the public are there with you?
I am at the Gelleris Family Education Center, 427 West Carroll Avenue, room number 2, Glendora, California, 91741. And no members of the public are here with me.
Thank you very much. First, we'd like to have public comment for items not on the agenda. Let's start first with anyone here in the physical location of the meeting. Okay, thank you. Also, if there is any public comments not on the agenda and that happens to be piping in through the Webex.
This is the moderator. We are now accepting public comments on Webex. If you would like to make a comment, please type the word comment into the Q&A box in the lower right-hand corner of the screen and send that comment to all participants. If you are a dial-in user, please dial *3 to raise your hand, and we will call on people in the order we have requests for comments. Let's take just a few seconds now to see if we have a request for public comment. Seeing no request for public comment, would you like to close comment at this time? Or, forgive me, move on to Gilda Dominguez?
Yeah.
We have a request that just came in from Patrick. Bear with us just a moment, Patrick, and we will send you a request to unmute your microphone.
Hello there, everybody. Thank you for allowing me to comment. I had a quick question. If we will be discussing if remote supervision will be allowed for RPEs.
Right, I know. Well, that's not something that we'll be discussing during the Hearing Aid Dispensing Committee meeting. I think that would be something that we can put on a future agenda for the actual board meeting or possibly the upcoming Audiology Practice Committee agenda.
He says thank you in text.
You're very welcome.
And now that appears to be the end of our request for comments at the moment.
Great, thank you very much. Then we'll move on to item 3, discussion and possible action to amend or adopt regulations regarding continuing education requirements and continuing education course content requirements for hearing aid dispensers and dispensing audiologists. We have in the pack that's under HAD 3. The board has gone through and made a number of the changes that we are proposing that we'd like to take an opportunity to talk about now that we have a lovely quorum. Sharice, did you want to go through each item or would you like me to go through it?
At your pleasure. I can do that for you if you'd like.
You have such a lovely voice.
Thanks. So the Hearing Aid Dispensing Committee is looking at making changes to the continuing education requirements for the hearing aid dispensers, and the most recent ones include quite a few different technical changes as well as some substantive changes. So if you look at attachment A, I'll just kind of go through them as they are. So we are making some clarifying technical changes at the top. It just makes it clearer and then gets rid of the old reference to 2017. We're also removing any gendered language. We're also removing subdivision E about renewals for the first time because we don't actually have the statutory authority to do so. The other is making when you've been expired for 3 years to be consistent with our statutes and for when a license will cancel. The next one is clarifying on applicants for initial licensure, the continuing education requirements. And G is a new provision that we're looking at adding, so it would be similar to the speech language pathology and audiology. And that would allow for courses that you teach to also be credited to you, once. So if you teach the same course multiple times, you can use it once per renewal cycle. So that's a provision we have on the speech and audiology side that we'd like to bring over to the dispensing side as well. And then in H, it's the recommendation. We have statutory authority to do so, and then it's also, I think, good practice, and also it's a very good learning experience that participation in examination, administration, or development. We just want to make sure we talk about how many hours they should be receiving. Obviously, boards differ, and we run a practical examination, so if you participate in the practical examination, that's administration. So whether or not we want to make up to a number of hours that can be accrued that way during a year. Normal boards only have examination development activities, such as going to an Office of Professional Examination Services workshop where they're developing the questions or deciding on the scoring and the cutoffs and those things. So our board, because we have the practical, we have subject matter experts that participate in the practical examination for hearing aid dispensers. It's a great opportunity. There's a lot of professional conversations that happen there. There is a lot of reviewing of different techniques and how the field's changing. It's not exactly the same as exam development, but it's both are, I think, viable ways to accrue some continuing education. So we just might want to look at, well, what do we think the maximum number of hours is? And then the last one in that first section is, again, it's also part of, I believe, their orders, but it also specifies here. So if you're taking continuing education coursework as part of your probation, it does not count towards your renewal requirements. So there's no double dipping when it comes to CE for probation versus your renewal. So those are all the changes in the first section on 140. The next section is where we had the conversation at the last committee about the need to allow a certain amount of fitting, programming, and troubleshooting that's related to equipment and devices, and how do we allow for those courses that benefit consumers' use of the hearing aid, but also restrict the more marketing, launching, promo type continuing education. So we went ahead and looked at this, and the blanket course content we removed, but we have added in the direct client care courses that it could include content on fitting, programming, and troubleshooting of equipment, devices, or other products of a particular manufacturer or company, only as it relates to benefiting a client's hearing and functional use of the equipment, device, or product. And then we've added over to the what's outside of the scope of acceptable courses, more about course content that's focused on marketing, launching, or demonstrating the marketability of the equipment, devices, or other products. So trying to get more towards allowing the more consumer beneficial aspects about particular devices, but also saying, no, if it's about marketing, launching, profitability, those kind of things, that way those are still prohibited. And staff would be reviewing those course outlines and the materials so that they can kind of fetter that out. But this was our first attempt to get something out there that would allow that beneficial fitting, programming, and troubleshooting part for equipment, but still restricting the marketing, promotional type stuff.
Sharice, why don't we pause there and we can maybe go through some of these in case anyone has questions or comments, just while it's a little bit fresh. Okay, so we
Absolutely.
can break it up a little bit. So the first highlighted area, does anyone have any questions or concerns or issues with that changing? Basically that a hearing licensee who holds a hearing aid dispensing license when applying for license renewal. Does anyone have any issues with that? I think mostly it's just cleanup language, right? Yeah. Okay. And then of course the non-gender pronoun. I don't think anyone would have an issue with that. Okay.
And apologies, we forgot to highlight the increase to 4 hours instead of 3 for the indirect or related care courses. Sorry, we missed highlighting that, but that was one thing discussed at the last committee meeting that we would like in there, or
Right.
that was preferred, and so we have that in there. We just missed highlighting it, so it wasn't bright yellow for you.
Anyone have any questions about the changes on the first page? Okay. So page 2. Any issues with the licensee getting hours for the course they're teaching at least once per year,
Once.
which I think is appropriate. Otherwise,
Yeah.
they'll want to teach it every month. And that's in line with what it is now. We only get credit for one course. We can't take the same course twice and get credit for it. So that's pretty much in line with what the regs are now.
Yeah. Definitely no repeating.
All right. So H, giving exam hours to, or credit hours to those who do the exam or the workshops. That was actually in place quite a few years ago, and then it kind of seemed to go away. And I almost kind of felt like it was coming back almost kind of as a carrot to get people to do the exams and the workshops, because I know they have a lot of difficulty getting people to do that. My personal feeling is, though, that they shouldn't get, honestly, more than 4 hours. Simply because one day at a workshop or at an exam, you wipe out your whole year's worth of continuing ed credits or close to it. And there is a lot of good back and forth and discussion and whatnot, but you're not really actually doing anything to further your education as a way to help the consumer. You know, so I feel like we should, you know, limit those hours to some number.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Maybe also consider, you know, you won't accrue more than X number of hours per day. You know, I don't think doing the exam, for example, we should be getting, I don't know, more than X number of hours. I think, you know, doing the workshop development on test development is pretty involved. That one's really interesting, I think. But again, I don't think it should be based on the number of hours you're sitting there. It should just be, well, if you're going to participate in this particular event, you can get X hours, and then not to exceed so many per renewal cycle.
Karen, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. 4 hours is good too.
I think it's enough of a carrot to get people to, you know, if we're using it as a carrot, without necessarily just, you know, letting them bang everything out in one day and then, you know, they're done. So do we agree we like the 4 hours? Do we think it should be less, more?
Do you think 4 hours is a maximum?
That's what I was thinking.
And they get that in one day, or are we going to limit that for one performance is the wrong word,
Well,
participation?
the exam is one day. The difference is the workshops, which are 2 days.
We actually run examinations 2 days in a row nowadays. We do them on a Friday and a Saturday. So
Oh, really?
Some people do 2 days in a row. Some people only come on Friday. Some people only come on Saturday.
Interesting.
We take what we can so that we can run our examinations right now. And we do a different protocol, bigger room, fewer number of people,
Is that
3
why
rooms.
it's 2 days now, because there's fewer people per day?
Yeah, so we're working to keep it safe, but in 3 rooms, and there are 2 rooms in our office that are conference rooms, and then a conference room down the hall, so.
Okay, interesting, okay.
2 hours per day.
Yeah, I guess if it's going to be 2 days, then, yeah, I guess we would have to break it down further then.
Yeah,
Okay.
I would agree. I think 2 hours per day, and then that encourages people to participate for 2 days, whether that be at the exam proctoring or a workshop, a full workshop.
Okay. Okay. So then we'd be looking at changing that to actually saying well, it already says each day of service, so 2 hours for each day of service. Okay. And then they would still have to come up with 8 hours on their own. Okay.
Okay.
And does anyone have any issue with the next paragraph concerning probation and getting your hours while on probation? Okay.
Todd, can we have Sharice read the changes? And did we talk about a cap on the number of hours? I know per day, but the total cap?
I heard a maximum of 4. Was that the intent?
Okay.
Only 4 for examination duties.
Well, then, of course, you have the other question to the cap is, okay, I do the test, but I also do a workshop. So do I get 4 and 4, or we just cap it at 4?
Oh, I thought we were talking about capping it at 4
Okay.
total.
Okay. I just want to be clear, because those are two very different, two very different things.
And some participate in both, and often, and some only do maybe one event for us a year. So it really does depend on the licensee, so.
Okay.
Yeah, 4 per day is a big chunk of their annual, so I'm a little uncomfortable with that. I think it should cap at 4.
Cap at 4, I would agree. Just a total of 4 as a cap.
Total of 4, and then 2 hours of credit per day of service, is that, so we'd be
Right.
2 hours per day of service with a maximum of 4 allowed for examination purposes.
Yeah, per year.
Yeah, renewal cycle, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, year,
Yeah.
in this case.
Yeah, or per your renewal period might be more appropriate, since everyone's quote-unquote year is very different. So per renewal period.
Yes.
Okay. So we're going to have her read that back so we...
So let me go ahead and give this one a shot. So if a licensee serves the board as a selected participant in board-sponsored examination development or examination administration-related functions, the licensee may receive up to 2 hours for each day of service with a maximum of 4 hours per renewal period of continuing education credit, and then you would strike out the last part for each day of service. So it would say 2 hours for each day of service with a maximum of 4 hours per renewal period of continuing education credits, sorry. I think at that point, we would want to go ahead and potentially remove the next line, because we're saying you can get up to 4, so that's 2 different times. So you don't really have to say only once per renewal period, because it's no longer you're getting all 4 for the day. So I think that next sentence of the licensee may claim credit for examination development or administration-related functions once per renewal period, I think that can be removed because we're giving it a maximum cap.
Yeah, it becomes redundant unless legally there's something that we need to have that in. That kind of is a sort of redundant statement.
I think so.
You know, just to level set as well, we have Karen Halbo here, who is your regulations counsel. So if you have questions specific to the regulations, we'll address those to her and she can come up.
Karen, come on down.
Oh,
Nope.
the button on the mic, yeah.
It's been 2 years.
No worries.
I don't think there's any problem removing that sentence, and Sharice was correct. Having it repeat there is not helpful.
Awesome, thank you. Are there any other concerns from a regulatory standpoint?
No.
Great, thank you. Okay. Then let's move to the next section that we talked about, which was updating what course content is allowable. So essentially what we're putting in here is allowing continuing education that deals with hearing aids, the devices, to count towards CEUs, which historically they did at one point, and then that was pulled back. And now we're looking to at least add some of it back in that is actually germane to what is going to assist the public. My feeling on this has been that scope of practice for a hearing aid dispenser is dispensing hearing aids. So to not be able to have continuing education on the dispensing of hearing aids, to me, just kind of seems counterproductive, you know. So there are certainly courses that I think are too basic, as you listed, and aren't necessarily focused on hearing aids, that I think are inappropriate. But those courses that are dealing specifically with programming, troubleshooting, actually the functionality of the hearing aid that would benefit the consumer by that person having more knowledge, programming the hearing aid, I think, is reasonable and understandable. You had a question concerning that?
No, I understand the point you're making, and that sometimes it's hard to find courses and so on that meet these. But historically, I remember when this came to be, and it came to be because the courses are always, nearly always, probably 95% offered by manufacturers. They are sales endeavors to get dispensers and dispensing audiologists to dispense their product. That's their goal. So I'm not sure that if we allow this, the way it's written, that isn't just going to lead to an influx of those manufacturers being back on the beat, trying to do that again. Now, we can tell them, this is the rule, okay? You can't be telling us how to market, how to do other things that to make money off these products. And they would probably tailor their workshops accordingly. But there aren't just like regular folks out there are going to put on workshops about this that aren't manufacturers. So let's not be naive about how that's going to go.
And I don't disagree. But there has been a lot of changes. I mean, back in the day when they were 3-hour classes, they'd give you lunch, they had all this time to get the continuing education. In my experience doing these courses on Audiology Online, as an example, with them distilled down to an hour, they really don't have time to spend on extraneous things, and it's more focused on the product itself. The reality is it is going to come from manufacturers because their trainers are the experts. And do they want you to buy their hearing aids? Yes, of course they do. But I don't think that necessarily then takes away from the information we're getting in order to better be able to program their hearing instruments or understand ways to troubleshoot them, new software that comes out to be able to program them as new product comes out. That's all critical information for us to have. And yeah, they clearly want you to buy their hearing aids. That's why they're doing it. That's why they're giving you the information. But I don't think one necessarily completely abrogates the other.
And I think this will go back to a lot more of staff reviewing these. So, you know, they submit the course, they submit the outline, they submit the descriptions and what they're going to be talking about. And staff's going to have to scrutinize this really carefully. We've got a good history of reminding them because people still, under the current rules, send in product-focused items, business-related items that we have to tease out and say, I'm sorry, your coursework can't be approved because it's this focus, it's that focus, and those are outside the scope. So it really does, it will put the onus on staff to be reviewing these to make sure when we see things that look like marketing, demonstration, promo, it's got to all go. But that would be the caveat is, of course, it's going to have to get teased out in the implementation.
Let me just address that. I totally understand what Todd is saying, and it's a reasonable argument about this, especially for dispensers. And we can create this carve-out where we're not allowing the marketing piece. But what you can't control is they'll do the workshop, they'll comply with what you want, but they're going to hand us handouts that show us how to market it. And then their marketing people are going to send us an email the next week. Thank you for attending this. Here's some marketing material on this. I don't know how you control that.
Well, honestly, I haven't seen that.
Well, we haven't seen it in a long time, but I used
Well, no, I mean, I do classes now, even though I'm not getting CEU credit for it. I do classes now online all the time because they've got new product coming out. I want to know how to program it because if someone walks into my office with a hearing device and I don't fit that regularly, I want to be able to have an understanding of how to program it because nowadays programming software isn't as similar from one to the other. They can be very different. I have, in all honesty, in all the courses I've taken, I've never had a single piece of marketing material given to me. I've never had a follow-up phone call from anyone. Is it possible? Yeah, it's possible. No, I mean as a participant in the class.
I mean, I get marketing materials weekly.
Yeah, right.
Without workshops.
Exactly, and that's my point, is we're getting that stuff anyway. Taking the class doesn't necessarily generate more of that.
Oh, I disagree.
I get, well.
I mean, it's been a long time. This has been in effect for quite a while. But I remember clearly going to these workshops and getting not only the take-home packet of information for marketing, but contact. They know you were there. You have to sign in and sign out. Your email is there. They know how to contact you, and they will send you marketing. That's my experience.
Well, they're not actually doing them in person anymore, though. It's all online through, say, Audiology Online.
Perhaps.
And maybe that's the buffer, and maybe that's why I haven't gotten it. I don't know, but they don't do person-to-person training any longer. They haven't done that actually for a number of years, well before COVID. And yes?
Oh, just when you're ready.
And so there is no table to where you take marketing materials. It's all, because we're separated, I'm sitting in my office or at home, they're where they are. We do the class, we log off and take the test.
It'll continue that way, but there is the possibility that they'll come back to face-to-face.
Yeah. Go ahead and let Paul, and then I'll have something after Paul.
I just wanted to mention that I think our goal here is to identify what is acceptable for continuing education requirements and what the course content can and cannot contain. And I think we're attempting to do that by saying that what is not acceptable is further down. We talk about what has to do with the marketing and some of the other areas that are just trying to sell a particular hearing aid. I don't think we're going to be able to control the post-marketing that might happen. I think it's very realistic that if they have your contact information, they're going to try to send you post-marketing materials. But I just don't think we're going to be able to address that here.
But we also have to make it clear that if they're going to hold workshops of any sort, especially face-to-face, that they not provide that kind of material at that event.
And that's where I'm wondering if that belongs inside of B2. So prohibiting the content and the distribution of materials for that purpose.
Yeah.
So that it's saying you can't teach on this and you can't distribute materials about this.
Right.
And that way we kind of hit both with one whack. Yep. And again, if we hear reports of providers doing that, we can address it the next time we see one of their courses.
Right.
You know, we're hearing reports of this, you know, maybe it becomes a point where we can't approve their courses if they're not willing to follow the rules.
Right.
And maybe that's how we address it here. So it's not just about course content, but also about materials distributed. So it could maybe be, and I'm sorry, I'm thinking it on the fly here, so roll with me, but course content. Well, let me think of this. Give me 2 seconds. My brain will go.
Amy, did you have any?
Well, I find the way this is written very confusing. So, I mean, this whole topic is very difficult to manage, and I think trying to understand how we can control it when you do go to any sort of manufacturer-sponsored training, even though all of the, yes, I need to know how this feature works and that feature works and how to program it. It's always peppered with XYZ device is so much better than competitor's XYZ device because of yada yada features that we have. So there is always an element of marketing no matter what, even if the focus of the event is on learning how to use the software, learning how to program it best for your patient's needs, et cetera. And so how to tease that out, or how to expect staff to be able to tease all of it out, I guess, based on how the event is presented on paper. But understanding, as Marcia is indicating, there's always going to be that element, come, and if you come to this one, you can buy 6 devices for the price of 4 and get your BOGOs and all of the other things that happen at those events is very, very common. And I understand the dilemma, and I think limiting, especially dispensers, but also dispensing audiologists from being able to attend educational opportunities because of there's some launch of a product, which is when the manufacturers hold these opportunities usually, is a challenge. So the way it's written here, how that's interpreted, or myself as a licensee, how do I know, well, gosh, is this really going to cross the line or not, and how to tell in advance? In advance, they should actually be saying it's a board-approved course. So they're supposed to get approval of the course prior to delivering it. Right. So that would be the first one for licensees' purposes. I mean, if we approve it, that's where you're at, is the licensee who's taking it, right? The harder part is going to be on our staff operationalizing it and taking a look at these things. I think we can use some of the prior ones, people that obviously did not read the laws and regs and went ahead and submitted the course anyways, and they're about marketing and devices, and so we can look at that. The harder part might be is kind of figuring out how do we audit it. How do we do a periodic attendance, just like you're supposed to audit on the speech language pathology and audiology side. You're supposed to audit the course providers every now and again to take a look at, are they actually providing the level of content they say they are? So is there a way to develop that? And I think there could be. I just don't know that it's in this. It's not right now in the course content regulation, but that could be something we look at, the potential for doing that and making this part of the package.
I think ultimately it comes down to, is the core information appropriate?
Yeah.
Whatever marketing they may or may not do. And that's really the difference between online CEUs versus in person. You're far more likely to get that in person than you are online. But however they couch it, is if the information is important and it's viable information, then it's viable information. We're adults. We understand that they're going to market to us. But if I go in and I'm looking for specific information that's going to help me with the consumer, and I get that, then I think it's a valuable course. And without having to necessarily spend $1,000 to get the CEUs that I need. We talk a lot about barriers to the provider and being able to do their work. That's a pretty big barrier when I have to basically spend $1,000 just to get my CEUs because I have to go somewhere to get it, because I can't get it online because those same courses are not offered live. So, one of my goals here is to be able to extend what offerings there are so dispensers don't have such a barrier to get their hours every year, and to have actual meaningful courses. So I get an hour learning about the history of artificial intelligence, but I don't get an hour for learning how to troubleshoot a hearing aid that may be the difference between someone having a successful experience or not. To me, that's just wrong.
Is there any discussion here related to a maximum number of hours that are received by going to manufacturer-based training, similar to?
Well, I don't know we do speak to the number of hours that can be used for non-related versus related. But that's certainly something that, we could potentially look at, as a way to try to trim it.
In 1399.140, when we're talking about continuing education required, that's where we limit the amount of related or indirect care courses. It's also where we cap self-study. So there is the opportunity to say that as well. So if it was deemed necessary and to ensure that you're getting appropriate continuing education, maybe a certain number of hours is the maximum you can get in product-focused or equipment, devices, or other product-related coursework. The difficulty is, again, we're trying to do the best to set the standards here, but over your lifetime as a hearing aid dispenser or dispensing audiologist, obviously it's going to change a lot, right? So we're trying to make the basis for everyone. But of course, some of those other courses may have been really handy when you first start out, but now that you've been around a long time, you are looking for more product-focused stuff because you've already hit all the basic care, all the basic direct client care items. You've updated yourself on those issues more often. But now you're looking at how do I best do my job and troubleshoot these things. So there is the option there. That is one way the committee could go is, yes, we're going to start allowing this product focus as long as it's not marketing, but also we're going to limit it just like we do indirect or related care. So that's also an option. Again, remembering you only have 12 hours, so.
Yeah, well, and so that we don't create such a convoluted formula, I need to have a calculator and understand trigonometry to figure out how many hours of the 12 of this and how many of that, and I would like to keep it as relatively straightforward as possible and not have multiple carve-outs. I think the carve-outs for the marketing materials and all that makes perfect sense. Any course that starts with the word introduction, pretty much wouldn't be, because that's introducing a new product. Again, that's basically a sales meeting, So, yeah, there are certainly, ways we can look at that if we want to drill down even more.
Well, and some of these things, again, it's how the board staff operationalize the regulation. So you can be as specific as you want, or you can direct staff to work with subject matter experts to really drill down and kind of figure out the best way to operationalize these items.
I think, though, unless you get a couple of dispensing audiologists and hearing aid dispensers on your staff to help go through these things, I think we need to keep it relatively, straightforward.
Currently, as it happens, when we get one that might confound us, it's usually going to go up to me, and then it might go to a subject matter expert. So we do use our senior examiners and our examiners to be kind of a sounding board, especially when it relates to something staff wouldn't understand. So.
Can I just say something, Todd, here? I want to echo what Todd is saying about making this as clear as possible for licensees. We've had to come up with job aids on our website to explain all the formulas that currently exist for speech-language pathologists and audiologists, dual holders, audiologists with dispensing licenses. And when I go out and talk to groups, that's one of the most confusing things for them to understand. I actually have people in the audience that ask me the same question. Those individuals ask me the same question every time I go because it can be rather confusing. So I think the focus here is whether this is approved course content or not, and we should try to keep it as simple as possible to try to avoid all the different extrapolations.
Yeah, that's my one concern about having multiple carve-outs.
I just have a quick question. If it wasn't for the actual companies that are doing these courses, who else would do it? Would it be like a local university or?
Who actually gives the courses?
Yeah.
If it's on a product, it's going to be by a manufacturer.
Okay. Yeah, because every hearing aid is specific to that exact product,
Yes,
right?
right, and their programs are a little bit different. I mean, there may be an independent, like a Lowell or something like that, company that might do that. I don't know of anyone, I've never seen in all my years, someone doing, have you seen it, other than the manufacturer doing a product?
Yeah, so it's kind of like, we have no choice but to use these. Okay.
You're right. And intrinsically, it is, at the root of it, they're trying to show
is,
you how great
yeah.
their product is,
And they
so
are
you'll buy it.
marketing. Yeah, and they are marketing about
Yeah.
it, but right now, there's nothing we can go around it.
Right, but speaking to Amy's point, you know, making sure it's written in such a way that, and what Marcia was also saying, written in such a way that, you know, they can't talk about, you know, sales or promotions of their product. You know, they stick strictly to, you know, product information and not spend time discussing promos or anything of that nature, because that's totally inappropriate.
Right.
You know, then,
And then they give you, then they end up giving you those promos later on in an email or something, like get a 2 for 1.
Honestly, again, I've
20%
never
off.
seen it.
Okay.
I mean, I guess it's possible, but I have not, and I'm not saying it doesn't happen.
Right.
But I honestly have never seen it happen.
Okay.
Not in the form it is now, where I go on to Audiology Online, and I would say, and if there's someone from Audiology Online out there listening in, they can correct me, but a vast majority of the credit hours that are used or gotten is through something like Audiology Online.
Okay.
There are certainly people go to HHP and CAA, but there's a lot of people who get their hours strictly through Audiology Online in 1 hour increments as opposed to a whole day.
Right. I mean, I think if we think about historically why this was initially eliminated as an option was at the time where ethically things were still happening, where we could go on a cruise with a manufacturer and take 2 days or 3 days of classes on the cruise boat and whatever location and knock out all your educational requirements by doing that. And I think that's where the heart of this came from back when the change was made. You know, since that time, things have significantly changed in the field in general, and those aren't ethically something that is allowable by most of our national organizations and things like that anymore. So I do agree, Todd. I see where things have changed. That's just not an acceptable practice anymore. And so having you know, that carve out completely maybe doesn't make sense anymore. But at the heart of it, right, what we're trying to do is make sure that consumers are being treated properly because their professionals are educated properly in the devices that they're using and in best practice techniques and keeping up with current techniques, right? So I think we want to avoid letting people go and get 100% of their education from a manufacturer, because I don't think that is probably a wide enough view for people to be exposed to practices. But, you know, I agree. I think eliminating all of this is also no longer necessary.
Right. So do we at least agree or not agree with the basic premise that we need to be able to allow, well, as it says, content on the fitting, programming, and troubleshooting of equipment, devices, and other products of a particular manufacturer or company? Do we agree that, at least at its basic principle, that is something that needs to be brought back into the fold?
I do. I agree with that.
Yeah.
Can I just ask a question, though? I don't take Audiology Online courses, but are most of those provided by manufacturers also? I mean,
actually, it's a wide variety. They've got hospitals, they have research audiologists that give courses, they have lots of different organizations give courses on Audiology Online. The ones that are involved with product are going to be by whatever manufacturer that is.
Okay, so that
but there is a huge range of providers. I would say, well, I don't want to hazard a guess, but there's a significant number of people outside of the manufacturer realm that do courses.
Yeah, no, I know. I just was saying the hearing aid related courses are those primarily put on by manufacturers? Those
are going to primarily be put on manufacturers because they are the subject matter experts for their own device.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Is there any further comment in the room concerning this section, we can move forward. We just have a little bit more to cover. So what we didn't go over was 1399.144.
And so this is about exemptions from continuing education, and these are essentially bringing you into conformance so that it's similar to the speech language pathology and audiology side, so that it's more spelled out, so that you have to submit the written request for exemption. There's for at least 1 year of the prior, for at least 1 year during the licensee's previous license renewal period, the licensee was absent from California for military service. They resided in another country, so they were out of the country. Or during the licensee's previous renewal period, the licensee was in, or their immediate family member were suffering or suffered a disability that's physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more of the major life activities of an individual. Disability shall be verified by a licensed physician or psychologist, and it just asks, them to provide to the board the nature and extent of the disability, an explanation of how it hinders the licensee from completing continuing education, and then provides kind of their professional, their name, license number, and how to contact them if there was questions. This just kind of brings you in similarly with the speech language pathology and audiology side. The one thing is that, of course, it's based on the 1 year, and that other side is on a 2-year renewal cycle, so that is a little different. So it would be, using the 1 year mark is saying that you were disabled for the whole year, or you were a caretaker for someone that was fully disabled for a whole year. And that's currently, right now it's just the broader language, which is the board in its discretion may exempt the continuing education renewal requirements for health, military service, or undue hardship. So, and we don't get that many of these requests. So this language is set forth just to kind of bring parity.
So it just brings us in line with, okay.
Yeah, it's the language from the other side, so.
Any questions or comments from the board on that? Okay.
Now, and then previously at the last meeting, staff was requested to provide the committee with the other states' requirements for hearing aid dispensers, so that's your other attachment in there. So that provides you with information on what other states are allowing or not allowing. And then there was also the question about summary of denied continuing education courses. And so we put together a list, staff did. And then a lot of them you'll see are business focused, some are about marketing, outside of the scope, and then a whole list of product focused ones.
It's the free trial one. Is that kind of like a coupon? Is that more like marketing, free trial?
Sorry. I couldn't hear you. I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. The first page, the third one, it says free trials. Identify patients for free trial. Describe free trial program. It's a summary of denied, oh, these are the denied continuing education.
Yeah, they're denied.
Okay.
These are all denied courses, so they were too business focused about how to provide clients with free trials and keep them. So you'll see sometimes it's business focused, sometimes it's marketing. Some were very broad. Some were very business related. What was it? What was it? Was it about unbundling? I think it was.
Yeah, there was an unbundling one.
Yeah. So while some of these might be interesting, they don't meet the requirements in what the course content cannot do, so staff have denied them. And so I think that was kind of the pleasure of the committee to go ahead and ask, like, what are we seeing in denials? And of course, yeah, it's all over the board, and some obviously did not review the regulations and went ahead and submitted that course anyways, but.
Just as a side note, for the states permitting hearing aids for the CE requirements for number 5, Arizona, they actually do have no more than 8 hours on business or client service practices or trends in the profession. So would that be similar to what we were discussing about the programming fitting? It's on the number 5, Arizona. If you see it, no more than 8 hours on business.
Well, that's actually stuff that we wouldn't allow, I think.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
No more than 8 hours sponsored by a single manufacturer.
Right, I see. So no more than 8 hours current on business or client service practices, which we don't,
Okay.
we don't allow.
And then how
But
about,
yes,
and then we don't allow that sponsored by a single manufacturer, right?
Yeah, currently, we don't allow that. So if we
Right.
were allowed them to do them, there is that opportunity as well.
Mhm.
yeah, I mean, we could theoretically break it
I don't want to
break
make
it
it more
down even
complicated than,
more. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So I'm saying it just gets to be
yeah. I
so
understand.
complicated that
Yeah.
it's hard to follow.
Yeah,
I would think those
I'm a simple man. I like it simple, easy to read,
yeah.
large block letters.
I think that's where, you know, you end up right back at 1399.140 and maybe we should. And what is that number? I don't know. Should, for simplicity's sake, should number 1 be credited in related, indirect, or by a single man? I mean, like, do you lump it all into one and say?
No more than X number of hours per manufacturer.
You could do that. You could even say, just like this is, you can allow these things that are not direct care, and they're not about the product, and that's where you get the bulk of your hours. That's essentially what's going on right now, is it has to be direct, and it can't be by a manufacturer, and that can be 9 of your 12 hours. That has to be 9 of your 12 hours, right?
Okay.
And they're saying we're limiting indirect and related. The hard part is by our definitions, we're saying direct care includes the
Programming.
the content on fitting programming. So you kind of almost would need a separate one that says, you know, manufacturer-sponsored courses, some sort of limitation maybe on that, and makes it very simple.
Well, each manufacturer will have like their own course, and it'd be like an hour or two, but each hearing aid dispenser, how many brands do you carry, right?
Depends on the dispenser or dispensing audiologist. I mean, most have a tendency to limit it to 2 or 3.
Okay.
Just for simplicity's sake, but you know, you want to have knowledge of a multitude of them, because who knows what's going to walk through your door. You know, the issue with limiting number of hours to a manufacturer, well, okay, but then if I only fit, say, 2 manufacturers, and I can only get 2 hours on those 2 manufacturers, then I have to spend time, you know, with other manufacturers, you know, which product I may or may not fit. I mean, there's pros and cons to go back and forth on this.
Yeah.
You know, either direction, quite honestly. You can make a case for both. It really just comes down to, do we want to simplify it as much as possible so, you know, Paul doesn't have to have these discussions 27 times a year? You know, just how much into the weeds do we want to get?
Right.
Well, I do think simple is important, but it's also important to make sure that people are getting the amount of education they should be getting, and we're not allowing someone to go off on a vacation trip and get all their units with one manufacturer. So
absolutely,
it's important, I think, bringing up how Arizona is doing it. It maybe is a little easier to carve out when you only have people renewing every other year. So they're, you know, they have a little more time. You know, it's easier to carve all those units out. When we're doing it in a 12-month cycle, it's a little harder because it's so many fewer units.
Right.
We're only doing 12 every 12 months. Might make it more challenging. So.
Well, the other issue too is Arizona allows for any IHS course you get credit for, which is an International Hearing Society. So if I know if it's an IHS course I can work, then I can figure those hours out a lot easier, because I basically have what's one-stop shopping for my continuing ed hours. So that's a whole other wrinkle. I think we mostly just need to decide, do we want only so many hours for a manufacturer or for hearing aid continuing ed hours versus others? and how many that is, and then if we want to take that number and break it down a second time to how much per manufacturer, we can look at that, I guess, as well. In the end, I can't help but keep going back to, thinking in our own sunset review, it says hearing aid dispensers are responsive, their scope of practice is dispensing hearing aids. Okay, well, if that's my scope of practice, then why isn't my continuing ed hours follow my scope of practice? In my mind, the majority of my hours should be within my scope of practice, not ancillary topics that don't necessarily have anything to do with me dispensing and fitting hearing aids. But, understanding the concerns that everyone has about, loading up on one particular topic, then I think it's reasonable to have a carve out and say this many hours for hearing aid dispensing. Because we can always come back a couple of years from now, once this thing happens, we can always come back and look at it and say, okay, is it working, is it not working, right? And we can do adjustments, accordingly.
I would just say that it's not the entire scope of the practice to fit the hearing aid, right? I mean, you have to test the hearing, you have to validate and verify the hearing aid. So there are multiple other tasks involved with the fitting hearing aids. So just knowing the hearing aid programming is not, 100% of what a dispenser is doing.
True. They just don't necessarily have continuing ed courses on any of that other stuff. They do have someone like real ear measurement, but they don't necessarily have courses on, audiometers and things like that. Not that I've seen, but, that in itself is a marketing thing because they're trying to get me to buy their audiometers. So we can go down the rabbit hole on that one as well, It
looks to me like hearing aids are moving in a more sophisticated direction in terms of programming and a chip operation in the hearing aids. And it's using a lot of neuroscience aspects to do those things. Neural networks, artificial intelligence, all that. So to say, well, yes, that isn't step 1 through 10 to fit this hearing aid, it's still irrelevant for all dispensers to understand the operation of the chip and the software. So I think there's appropriate courses in there that would behoove your understanding and thus make you a better dispenser.
Shall we call for comment? In the room here with us, is there anyone who'd like to comment on this or any of the subjects that we've covered so far? Nope. Should we call for comment on Webex?
We are now open for public comment on this matter in Webex. If you would like to make a comment, please type the word comment into the Q&A box in the lower right-hand corner of the screen and send that comment to all participants. If you are a dial-in user, please dial *3 to raise your hand, and we will call on people in the order we have requests for comments. I saw a hand flash up and down. We have a request from April Dolan. Bear with me just a moment, please, and I will send you a request to unmute your microphone.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Hey, hi. I'm April Dolan. I'm the Continuing Education Administrator for Audiology Online, as well as a licensed audiologist in the state of Texas. And I know Audiology Online was kind of thrown around during that discussion a few times, and I just wanted to make myself available to answer any questions.
Thank you.
Seeing no other requests for comments, do you wish to close comments at this time?
If we can also request comment for our other remote site, if there's anyone that happened to show up there. Mathilda?
No, no one from the public is here.
Thank you. Let's go ahead and close the comments in. materials.
So to
Okay,
clarify,
Recommendation.
Right. So do we want to go forward with the staff recommendation language as is, or do we want to send it back for another pass with some of the other suggestions that we have made concerning the carve-outs?
Well, we can take the changes that we've made today, since it's a recommendation, and present that to the board.
Okay.
That's my understanding, right? The changes that we've discussed, that we've reached consensus on, we can take those forward, right?
Well, if we're talking about making a motion to recommend the language to the full board, yes, that could include the changes that were made today.
As amended?
Correct.
Okay. Okay.
did we have clarification on whether we were limiting the equipment, device, or product content, like a number of hours, or did we not? Because I don't have any notes on that.
I think it was just a discussion, about it, but not any decision.
Okay,
That was-
not any language per se.
Yeah, I think we can just, I don't know, keep it open for now and then see what happens.
That's something that we could then discuss with the full board.
Okay.
Yeah.
Or keep it open for now and then see what happens
Yeah.
when this is implemented and see what's,
Well, I think we have to have the full board approval.
Yeah.
So we can leave it open as not carving out a specific number for the carve-outs, and then that would allow the full board a chance to
Agreed.
to weigh in, and then we can, go back, and if we need to change it, could we then change it at that time?
Okay.
Would that be acceptable, legally speaking?
Yes.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, ma'am.
I believe there was hanging that she was looking at
Yes.
for subdivision B, talking about what is outside the scope, that for the second one, course content or distribution of materials focused on blah, blah, blah. Was that, you
Yeah.
were working on it, but I didn't.
And that's
hear you
where
read it.
I wasn't sure if we wanted to just simply include or materials distributed, or if we should add a second sentence that said, this includes the distribution of materials during the course or after the course. So that way it's saying the prohibition in the first sentence regarding marketing, launching, and demonstrating the marketability of equipment, that includes materials distributed at or after. I don't know if we can get away with after, but that would kind of hit the point of like, you're not supposed to. Like, you're not supposed to use this as an opportunity
Right.
to send more marketing material to your course participants.
I think that hits it.
Okay. So,
That's clearer.
Yeah.
And now it's been read into the record. If you're saying as amended, she has that clearly there.
Yes.
Todd, I just have one question. When you do these courses, they don't give you like some type of booklet that gives you like a step-by-step, so after the course, you can go back and take home, right? And take back to your office and take a look at it and review it, right?
Yeah, because typically they're going to give you the PowerPoint slides
Yeah.
that has
PowerPoint slides.
what they discussed in the steps, yes.
Okay. I just want to make sure that is not included in B2.
Right. So
I don't want-
marketing material.
I don't want the manufacturer
coursework.
to not give anything back to the students when not.
Can I just ask, maybe Michael knows, when you try to restrict a manufacturer from marketing their materials, is there any restraint of trade issue with that?
I think that's something we'd probably need to take a look at on a case-by-case basis. In terms of commercial speech, perhaps, but in the regulatory context, what you need to be able to show is that is a basis for the requirement, that there's some necessity in terms of promulgating the regulation.
Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Okay. So then we need a motion to accept the language as amended to be presented to the board.
I motion to accept the language as amended. Is that okay? Motion right now? Can we do that?
I think, and to recommend it to the full board.
And to recommend the full board.
Second?
Okay, call the roll. Marcia?
Aye.
We do need to take public comment.
Oh,
on
you're right,
this.
yes. Let's open it up for public comment before we vote.
Gonna pause you.
Anyone here with us in the room? So let's open up to the Webex, please.
We are now open for public comment on Webex. If you would like to make a comment, please type the word comment into the Q&A box in the lower right-hand corner of the screen and send that comment to all participants. Dial-in users, please dial *3 to raise your hand, and we will call on people in the order we have requests for public comment. And our first request for comment comes from April Dolan. Bear with me just a moment, and I will send you a request to unmute your microphone.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Okay. So I guess as the CE administrator for Audiology Online, with the language as amended, I'm wondering if there would be any sort of grace period while we're trying to figure out exactly where that line is. Because at this point, submitting courses for $50 per submission, it's kind of a financial hit to us to submit things if we're not entirely sure that it's going to be approved. So I'm just hoping that there would be either a grace period or some more specific language about what exactly is allowed and what isn't, just from that standpoint. Thank you.
Seeing no other requests on Webex, do you wish to move to Gilda?
Please.
There was no one else present with me for public comment.
Thank you. Sharice, did you have a comment?
Yeah, so I think it's important to think about, these are course approval applications. So if there is something that can be fixed as a deficiency, that could be one way to do that, so that we continue to work with providers. I don't know that it would be like a checklist they can look at and don't include this language. I don't think it'd be that simple. But currently, I'm not quite sure what a grace period does if this opens up the table or opportunities more than it does, because it's not like we're going to take away the ability to do something. We're adding the ability to do something. So
Correct.
I'm just a little confused on the grace period. So.
Well, I think it's also incumbent on us to make sure the language is very specific and clear, so there is, they're able to read it and tell what we're talking about.
And if not, then we should continue to work on it and flesh it out.
And they'll have an opportunity to comment further when it goes before the full board as well. Okay.
The time it's going to take this package to get where it's going, there'll be plenty of time.
Okay, if there's no further comment, we have the motion seconded. I'll call the roll.
Were you going to check Gilda's sites?
She said there was no one there.
Thank
you. We did that before you guys called. Okay, so myself, Todd Borges, aye. Marcia Raggio.
Aye.
Karen Chang.
Aye.
Amy White.
Aye.
The ayes have it. Thank you. Okay, we have one other item to go over in our binders, HAD 4. Discussion and possible action regarding examination requirements for hearing aid dispensers and dispensing audiologists, as stated in Title 16, CCR Sections 1399.120, .121, and .122.
Thank you, Mr. Borges. Bray here with your regulations on exam requirements for hearing aid dispensers and dispensing audiologists. This is a combination of two previously board-approved languages that has been amended to include changes that we've identified as well as our legal counsel, and now requires review and approval. This regulation will align our regulations with current hearing aid dispensing exam process, as well as streamline the licensure for dispensing audiologists who have demonstrated extensive clinical and professional training. In 2018, the board requested DCA to conduct an occupational analysis on the audiology practice in California in accordance to Business and Profession Code 2539.1. At the May 2008 meeting, DCA presented their report. The information included the analysis of the examination requirement for dispensing audiologists, and based on this analysis, DCA determined that that audiologists wishing to dispense hearing aids should not have to take hearing aid dispensers' practical examination, and recommended that the board evaluate whether the practical examination was creating an unnecessary barrier to licensure. At its August 2008 meeting, the board evaluated the current exam requirements and consider whether different examinations should be administered, or if the current examinations are appropriate based on the information provided. Board approved motion to accept the recommendation to remove the practical examinations for dispensing audiologists and directed staff to work with legal in drafting regulations language. Due to COVID, staff or resources, the regulatory package was delayed. On July 29, 2021, board staff submitted and adopted proposed text to DCA prior to initiating the pre-review process. In that pre-review process, the DCA legal identified changes to the regulatory, to the language, in particular for dispensing audiologists, and identifying it lacked clarity for when it came to the examination. Our current examinations regulations lack clarity in what a written examination was, or when you're looking at practical exam, there was extensive language on practical exam, but nothing on the written exam. So it proved a clarity issues when needing to refer to regulations which exam dispensers had to use. So this, as I mentioned, is a combination of two language. The board had previously looked at making changes to the examination language, and so we took it a little further to make it more clear to the public what's the current process, as well as include regulations of the process of the written exam. That way we can move ahead with removing the practical examinations for dispensing audiologists. Are there any questions on the information presented? I can also go through each section on the proposed text and provide a basis for the changes as well.
I just have one question on page 1 of 8, out of the proposed regulatory language. 1399.120 B, I think it's B, so far down here. It says that you're only going to allow a certain number of examinees to take it at any particular time, and that applications will return to all those who are not in the first maximum number. And it doesn't say anything about returning their money. Have they paid at that point or not?
No, I'll go ahead and answer that. We don't process payment for the practical examination until you actually know you're going to be allowed in. So
Okay.
that gets returned to them.
Okay.
And just to add a little more clarity here, we put in the provisions about the number of applicants is based on health and safety considerations and the availability of examination space and examiners, because that's really been the biggest thing, is are we even allowed to hold an examination due to safety protocols during the pandemic? And then once we were, availability of examiners and space that was appropriate, that became the bigger consideration. So 50 is kind of a big number when we're so limited, but we are trying to do as many exams as we can, and we're trying to work at new and innovative ways to get as many people through as we can and get closer to 50, but the whole previous restriction of 50 was just a number thrown out there, and at least this gives us the criteria that if we ever have additional space and more examiners, we could move up. If health and safety requirements change, it can go back down. So it gives us a lot more ability to address it.
This also gives us flexibility. We have a current model of the way we have conducted examinations. Examiners, those of you that have done an exam have come to this building, and we had one large event, you know, on a Saturday. So this gives us flexibility to have as many exams as we want and determine what the maximum allowable is based on what we can do.
May I ask a question? Just reviewing this language, it previously said the first 50. And what I don't see here is, what do you do if you have more than the maximum number? How do you determine who takes the exam?
Did you want to address that, Charisse, or did you want me to?
I believe in there it says applications in the order received, so that's how we determine who takes the exam. And we're removing 50 so that we can determine what number the exam, depending on the number of examiners we can have. If another pandemic creates quarantine where we have to create more space and limit the number of participants. So, so in the, I think towards the end, it explains what the number, how that determines.
Right, and the current process is so limiting that if you're not at the front of the line and you're not part of those 50, according to the regulation, we automatically send everything right back, and then you have to get in line again. So we actually are trying to, we actually try to accommodate those people by holding another exam. So we're trying to make a process that is flexible enough so that we can continue having the exam. It's not limiting, it's actually allowing for more. It's more permissive.
Yeah, I see that there. My concern was if you had a space of 20 exam slots and you got 40 applications, how you did. But it does seem to still include that language about the order in which they're received.
Yeah, so opposed to taking those 20 and sending them back, now we're just saying, okay, now Charisse or the administrator has the flexibility to say, I'm going to take these 20 and put them in the next exam, which could be next Thursday or next Friday, instead of going through the whole process of making them reapply.
And so just as a random, give you a little closer window into the operations, we actually, when we open the filing period, we number it, we put the time it was received, it goes in that order, outside of course legal requirements. So if there's a legal requirement for military to go first, they would get that. So we try to honor that process there, so first come, first serve. So usually on filing day, there are people ready to hop into our lobby at 8 a.m. Because they want to get that application in and be first. So,
I have a question. I think I asked this before, but what happens if they pop into your lobby, but your lobby's in Sacramento? So what about people in LA or Central Valley?
Most of them are sending it FedEx for the very early morning delivery. So the FedEx guy is at our door as well, along with those people in the lobby. So they're usually up there first. So they ask for the AM drop-off via FedEx. So that's often what we see. Right now, we have to take the first 50, and then 50 is the cutoff. So this would also make it a little different. Early on, we were just trying to get through the backlog. We had to cancel, I believe it was the April examination in 2020, and so we were just trying to honor those folks and work through that. We are now up to new applications, and so we keep trying to get more days, more examiners, and look at more opportunities, just to kind of get everybody through that we can. I think this regulation in particular, the whole removing dispensing audiologists from the practical exam, also takes them out of the running, so it's more about hearing aid dispensers and the practical exam. So that also does change the dynamics in the future as well. So.
But our goal is to get the language to not limit us, because that's what it has done for years. And when I first came to the board, there were people that had not been able to take the exam for a few years, and it was like the old, you wait in line for a ticket for a rock concert, and if you were the first one at the ticket outlet, you were in luck. If not, you were just out of luck. So we would have people come to us from certain employers that would have a stack of, oh, there's your 50 right there. There's 50 applications, and there it goes. So, they were almost to the point of just camping outside and waiting for that door to open, because it was so important for them to get to the exam. And that's a problem with the language, that, oh, it's 50, got to cut it off, start all over again. So we're trying to get away from that and trying to make it easier for folks that need to take the exam.
No, I think that's a really great idea, and it more fair, I guess. Yeah.
Can I just ask for verification on something? I think I didn't know this. I'm looking at page 4, top, number 10. Is that true, that if you fail a certain portion of the exam, you only have to retake that? Is that the way it works now?
It is. So it was an evaluation done by the Office of Professional Examination Services, and I'm trying to remember when we brought that.
Not that long ago.
Not that long ago.
Recent.
Yeah.
So the practice of failing something early on would negate your going forward with any of the other stations. Does that happen?
No.
Different stops are graded in different ways, and there are some safety concerns that are a ultimate stop. You must stop and you must move out of that section. But I don't want to divulge too much, but there are different ways of different stops, and sometimes the person is allowed to continue on with the exam, but they lose the points for that activity, per se.
Okay.
And there's other times where you're done with this whole section.
Okay, got it.
Are we going through each line step by step, or can I just add a quick comment? Oh.
Well, if we...
Like how you did it for the last
one. We can do that if we want, if you'd like to, just kind of a brief overview. It's mostly this is, that's what I was going to say. We can, I was just going to say that we can hop to the summary as opposed to going through each item by item.
Yeah, the first page, the items that were removed, they're outdated language, mostly we believe in regards to the written exam, but because we needed to be more specific, we have removed that and made the written exam its own section. And then there's the updated filing period on the bottom that we were just discussing. On page 2, on the top part, that is the, when the board last saw these language, that was the suggested changes on the topics that are covered in the examination, practical examination. So we left that as is. We didn't have any suggested changes on that one. And then, let's see. And then the second half of page 2 is where we started to describe the application. So our applications need to be in regulations, and so we went with the narrative format when it comes to the practical examination. So that's what you see on page 2, 3, and maybe top of page 4. So it's a list of all the items we collect on the application. And so we put the fee amount, personal information, address. We also have, as Charisse had mentioned previously, we have the expedited process, so asking if individuals are, military or spouse of a military or asylum. And then we do collect information about exams they've previously taken and which they fail, as well as the request for accommodation for practical examination. So that pretty much is it for the first section, 1399.120.
And just to clarify, so this is essentially putting what currently exists into the regulation.
Mm-hmm.
So there currently is a fee and there currently is a form, and this essentially codifies it of what it is. So.
And then the next section is 1399.121, and that's where we're going to describe the written examination. And so here we list the topics that will be covered, as well as we also provide, we also put in the application requests in there, the application information description in here as well. Yeah, so it's similar to the practical exam essentially, but having in regulations what is already available to the public.
Just a quick comment, just for consistency's sake. The thing that popped out to me, anyone cheating will be removed from the examination room. On the 1399.120, it's in A, and then on 1399.121, it's in D. Just to make it consistent, maybe we could do it either in D or in A together, right? Like so in written examination, D is fine, and then in practical examination, put it in D. Just to make it like.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. So for anything that's already in regulations, ideally we don't want to move it.
Oh, okay.
So that's why it's A, because
Okay.
we had removed all the other items, but we found it applicable for the practical exam, and so we were adding it also to the examination.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, since it's already in the practical examination, in that format, that's why it's A.
Mm-hmm. Got it.
But we can move the other one to A if that's, since we are adding it there.
Got it. I understand now. Mm-hmm. And just to clarify, to do the practical and the written, the total then would be $725. $500 for practical and $225 for written, right?
That is correct.
Right.
Briefly, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I have if they have to retake it, do they pay again? Even if it's just that one single part?
Yes, they do.
Okay.
Unless they win an appeal, correct? Then they.
Yes,
if
they
win their
can
appeal,
appeal,
then
and there's a section on that.
I saw that appeal.
Examiner misconduct. So we do have OPS and senior examiners review appeals, and of course, then we make a determination. There are times where the examiners and myself believe it's merited to allow them to retake for free, and it just depends on the circumstances.
Okay.
I had a question, it's just a very small thing. 1399.121 B, where it says commonly employed in fitting and selling of hearing aids, including. Should that maybe say including but not limited to? It has to say including?
Yes, we've actually had the Office of Administrative Law become very uncomfortable with the including but not limited to. They feel that that's vague, that doesn't give enough specificity, and courts have ruled that shall include or including is an expansive term, so you don't have to have the phrase but not limited to for it to mean not limited to.
Okay, but they let you got away with it
everywhere
earlier, because you actually have including but not limited to in an earlier section, so you're allowed one.
Well, no, I saw it, and because it has to do with how the Office of Administrative Law is now interpreting and requiring the justification, I consider that a non-substantial change that the executive officer is granted to do, and so I kept my mouth shut as I sat up here and saw included but not limited to, but I crossed it out because you have other things to think about.
Maybe they won't see it. Okay, thank you. Any other questions or comments about this one area she's covered? Okay.
So we're on page 7. We're looking at 1399.122 on the practical examination appeals. And these were changes that the board adopted previously that we're just bringing it back here to make it as part of the examination packet. We had no suggested changes. And then lastly, it's 1399.152.4 on the dispensing audiologist exam requirement, and this will make specific that the written exam or the examination to dispense hearing aid will be only the written examination, and so this is the regulations that will remove that the practical examination requirement.
We can get clarification, sure. Yeah.
Just one thing on the going over the outline. This is one thing that's been talked about in the past was the amount of questions on the test related to state and federal guidelines and regulations, and what a tiny portion of the test usually covers that. It would be number 4, page 6. Has there been any discussion about looking at expanding that with having OPES look at maybe expanding that so there's more emphasis put on what would be considered the ethical and legal aspects of the job?
I think there's a couple of things. One is we're going to talk to OPS about the exam itself and about what the exam should contain. And then I asked staff to look at that, and I think they worked with legal on identifying that specifically in regulation. He's talking about the issues that have to do with the sales,
Okay,
and the warranty information.
Page 5, we have California state and federal laws and regulations concerning the sale of hearing aids, which shall include the legal obligation to client to adjust, replace, and refund hearing aids, and requirements of documenting hearing aid sales. And so that covers like Song Beverly or, Song Beverly, or some of the disclosure like the lock hearing aid, and then maintaining records for the 7 years. So that's the language we have. I defer to Paul about how we can work with OPS to make sure that that gets a little bit more emphasized on the exam.
So this is the beginning of that process, identifying it in law, codifying it in regulation. We're trying to make sure that if it's weighted here, now we go and make sure that the individuals that are creating these exams apply that to the exam.
What about the option of increasing the weight of it? So right now it's 3%. And the option going back and saying, hey, should this maybe be 5% or 10% or what?
I think that's something we can talk to them about, but there's a whole process that goes into the development of the exam. And I think part of that is our discussions with OPES and making sure that they understand that it has its proper place. But I do think that there's a whole exam development process that needs to be followed to certain practices involved there. So we will do our best to make sure that that happens.
Thank you.
And then provided for materials are the previously board-approved language, as well as the outline that we use to develop the written exam topics. And I believe also there's a practical exam, the most current task and knowledge.
Thank you. Any questions? We open up to the public. Are there any questions? You can open up Webex.
We are now open for public comment on Webex. If you would like to make a comment, please type the word comment into the Q&A box in the lower right-hand corner of your screen and send that comment to all participants. If you are a dial-in user, please dial *3 to raise your hand, and we will call on people in the order we have requests for comments. Let us take just a few seconds now to see if we have a request for public comment. Seeing no requests for comments, would you like to move on to Ms. Dominguez?
Please. Please.
There's no one else present with me for public comment.
Thank you. I don't see where there was an action requested on this section.
There is.
Did I miss it?
Page 2 of the memo, it has
I looked and looked for that. I knew there had to be something we had to act upon if we were going
that
to
the committee may wish to
Okay,
recommend.
there we go.
Mhm.
Okay, so then we're looking for a motion for the committee to recommend that the full board approve the regulatory language and initiate the rulemaking process.
Oop.
You're on.
So I move that that the committee wish to recommend to the full board to approve the regulatory language and initiate the rulemaking process.
I second.
If we could open the floor to public comment. And if we could open up the Webex, please.
We are once again open for public comment on Webex. If you would like to make a comment, please type the word comment into the Q&A box in the lower right-hand corner of the screen and send that comment to all participants. Dial-in users, please dial *3 to raise your hand. We will call on people in the order we have requests for comments. We're going to take just a few seconds now to see if we have a request for comment. Seeing no requests for comments, do you wish to move on to Ms. Dominguez?
Please.
No one present for public comment.
Thank you. Okay, if we can then call the roll. Marsha,
Aye.
Amy,
Aye.
Karen,
Aye.
and myself, Todd Borges, aye. Motion carries. And I believe that is our last topic we have for the Hearing Aid Dispensers Committee. Thank you all very much. I appreciate all your time and putting up with me for my first in-person committee meeting. Yay. All right, thank you very much. Meeting adjourned.
What do you think about taking 5 minutes before we release? Yeah. So I'd like to call to, sorry. What do I have to do? Oh, okay, sorry. Are we ready? Okay. I'd like to call to order the Audiology Practice Committee, and I'd first like to call the roll. Karen Chang?
Here.
Amy White?
Here.
And I am here also, so I think we have a quorum. I'd like to ask any staff or board administration to identify themselves if they'd like to.
Paul Sanchez, Board Executive Officer.
Michael Knutz, Board Legal Counsel.
Shirley Burns, Assistant Executive Officer.
No? Okay. At this point then, I'd like to ask for public comments for items not on the agenda. If we can open Webex.
We are now open for public comments on items not on the agenda. If you would like to make a comment, please type the word comment into the Q&A box in the lower right-hand corner of the screen and send that comment to all participants. For dial-in users, please dial *3 to raise your hand, and we will call on people in the order we have requests for comments. Let's take just a few seconds now to see if we have a request for public comment. Seeing no requests for comments, would you like to move on to Ms. Dominguez?
Yes, thank you.
There's no one present with me for public comment.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to move to agenda item number 3, discussion and possible action regarding statutory and/or regulatory requirements related to audiology aid scope of practice and supervision requirements as stated in Business and Profession Code Section 2530.2 and Title 16, CCR Section 1399.154 through 1399.154.7. I'd like to just begin by summarizing the issue. The board has received a number of reports through various means that there appears to be a lack of clarity about the role and tasks that an audiology aid can perform, and also the supervision requirements for audiology aids. There appears to be the feeling that either it's that audiology aids historically have been allowed to do essentially anything an audiologist could do without the experience and training to do it, or the interpretation is that it's so restrictive that they can't do anything, and therefore, what is the point of having an audiology aid? So we are well aware of these concerns and the complaints about them. We know that audiology aids are trained, at least on the job, to do certain tasks. And some people are trained well and some people aren't. We can't control that. We do ask for applications for this register. This is not a licensee, but a registration with the state. We asked what the plan is for, what the activities they'll do, the training they'll receive, the supervision they'll receive. But even so, that's still not clear enough. But historically, the reason we didn't move on this sooner or make more definitive plan is because it was difficult to determine lists that contain do's and don'ts for audiology aids because they were either thought to be too restrictive or they were interpreted as, it was open to interpretation that led to confusion about what they could do and what they couldn't do. So you'll notice in our board book package on this topic that all of the current language, the statutory and regulatory language appears on page 2 through, I think, maybe 5. So in discussing this further, we wanted to look at how should we approach this, considering the conflicts. And one way that we're thinking about it, or possibly would go, is to create a license type and determine it to be an audiology assistant, as much as a SLPA would be a licensed entity. And that, I think that's gaining popularity, that idea of then creating all the requirements to make it very clear what they can and can't do. But in the meantime, we want to put some structure on what is the current practices. What's allowed, what's the scope, what are the limitations or parameters, and move toward this licensure category at some point. But at this point, I would like to open up the discussion to talk about how we could, at this point, kind of put some structure to the current allowances, I guess I should say. I'm interested in what Amy has to say.
Yeah, so in reviewing, really pages 4 and 5 here, bringing up the discussion on should we try and be all-inclusive, where we're defining everything that an aide can do versus looking more at just the prohibited side and listing out what would be prohibited. And I think that the latter is probably an easier way to go, discussing prohibited practices rather than trying to define all of the items that they can do, but instead look at what they cannot do. And then as looking at more like how the SLPA has defined levels of supervision and maybe more clearly defining that would also be relevant and helpful.
I think we would agree that there are certain activities that require more supervision than others, and would be able to delineate that much as the SLPA model does. One notion is that we could say at this point that an audiology aide cannot do anything that requires a license to do. That may not make some people happy, because the reason they have an audiology aide is to free up the audiologist so that they can do other jobs, see other patients, do whatever they want to do. But if it takes a license to do ABR, tympanometry, ear mold impressions, are we being safe or too restrictive to say if it takes a license, an aide should not be doing it?
Would you be able to give me an example then, just a short example then, what an audiology aide can do?
Yeah, I think there are some listings in here somewhere about it.
Oh, right here, I see it.
That makes it safe activities that they can do. They're allowed to perform maintenance, preparation, and infection control procedures for testing equipment, testing materials, and treatment. Allowed to perform and administer without interpretation, which is an important piece to this. They can do it, they just can't interpret what the results that they get. Although the next thing says audiology aides with adequate training allowed to perform without interpretation,
yeah.
Otoscopy, tympanometry, and taking ear impressions. Again, those are items that really do take a license to be able to do. And you can't do otoscopy without interpreting at the very same time. It's innate in doing it.
Okay. So it would just be they could do basically the first bullet point, and then possibly the second bullet point.
Yes.
Okay, but not the third.
I don't think so, no. And this is an exhaustive list. There are other things than audiology aids.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add, Dr. Rajo, that at the end of the packet, there are examples of potential audiology aid tasks, and there's another page with potentially prohibited tasks.
Are you looking at the AAA document or action? Or
talking about attachment H?
Yeah.
The end page, I see it, yeah.
Attachment
Oh, that's
H.
a good one, yeah.
It's
the very last page. Oh. So we could adopt a list like this at this point.
Is this list okay? If you look at it, I'm not in this field, so.
I know,
Yeah.
you notice at the top it's labeled potentially
Acceptable to, yeah.
So who makes the determination whether it is or not? And if so, if we said, well, assisting with treatment programs, that's a pretty broad statement, treatment programs.
Well, it says assisting audiologists in treatment programs, right?
With physical preparation for patient for evaluation. You know, I think that many of these are reasonable. It says performing ear impressions under direct supervision. An audiologist would say, if I have to stand there over the shoulder, I might as well do it myself.
Exactly.
I was reading, I think it was in one of these materials, I believe from ASHA, that was talking about direct versus indirect supervision, and that, I wish I had highlighted that page, that they were both considered to be in the physical proximity of, and you didn't have to be like over the shoulder line of sight, but you had to be in an adjacent room, and either of those would be acceptable in terms of what they consider direct versus indirect. I don't know if we want to consider something similar, because I agree, you know, if we're saying, well, you can do an ear impression if I'm standing here watching you, then why wouldn't I just do it myself?
All right, no, I understand that, and that makes sense to me, that if you're in the proximity, this is all prefaced on the notion that they're adequately trained, right, and that they have been over-the-shoulder supervised for many, many impressions before they.
So is in that, as you mentioned in the introduction, talking about moving perhaps more to something more akin to like an audiology assistant, where there's a more education requirement of some sort, is our goal initially here to tighten up what we're doing with the aid because there is no significant education component, kind of perhaps even be reducing that down to what they're allowed to do, with the intention of moving forward for creating a different category with education required that would then be more broad in terms of their ability?
I think I need some clarification a bit on that. There is discussion in here about developing continuing education and registration, but my understanding is that would be part of the audiology assistant regulatory package, and not, or statutory even, and not necessarily the objective of what we're trying to do today.
Would you like me to clarify?
Are we talking about the proposals that were part of our sunset review?
I think that's where they're maybe getting a little bit crossed. So any talk about an audiology assistant as a separate registration category, how the SLPA assistant is, would require a sunrise application with the Business and Professions Committee and some statutory authority to create that new type. So this is not that. We do understand that is a national trend, and most likely it will come our way. And in the meantime, we currently have a very vague category of aid that seems to be encompassing some of these people that will probably be going for assistant. We are seeing more applications with people with more education and experience coming in, which is, I think, begging the question of can they do more? And we should really, we're looking at how do we tighten up the aid registration, knowing that in the future the assistant category may come along, but this is not to prepare it at all. So it's a little bit separate, and that's the hard part.
I think I understand that, but it was just the issue of the CEU issue and having to be registered. That's part of the future regulatory.
And that's part of the sunset provisions, to have a renewal and continuing education requirement for the aid. And that is currently not in our sunset bill yet. It is still under discussion with the legislature.
Okay, so it will be, or we hope to be.
We hope.
So that's also a separate track, but it's part of the looking at the audiology aid and the whole designation of the audiology aid and what it should be. But that is separate. Oh, I'm not. Okay.
Yeah, you are.
Yes. Okay. But that is separate, and I think that what Amy described, what Dr. White described, was actually accurate, and I think a good direction for the board, because you are looking at consumer protection, and you're looking at something, a designation that is somewhat broad, vague to many people, and unclear. And if there is a trend in the practice of audiology to have these assistants, and they're coming with training and certification, that's something That's something that the board will want to probably look at and possibly pursue.
And so that begs the question then, what if, right now it is very broad. So certainly we have aides operating where they are doing impressions and maybe things that might be a little more, certainly potentially dangerous if they're not trained properly. Were we to tighten these restrictions, would those practices be grandfathered in, or would they say, you know, we would say, no, even if you're already a registered aide, you've been doing this for 10 years and you are trained, it doesn't matter, you're no longer allowed to do X, Y, and Z based on the decisions we're making?
That's an interesting question.
Well, we currently have an examination that the purpose of the examination is to ensure that a person who is going to dispense hearing aids can properly fit hearing aids and make those ear mold impressions. So I think we would have to be really specific about that and let people know that if you're going to do that, you need to get a license. You need to pass an examination to do that. I think that does require a license.
But is that current? I mean, has that been these plans? Because right now, the way it's written, you submit a plan of what you want your aide to do. This is how I'm going to train them. This is how I'm going to use them. These are the activities they're going to pursue for me. Have we been disallowing things like ear impressions, or has that sometimes been accepted based on the plan and the training? So do we have aides out there doing those activities?
They shouldn't be, and I think that's the purpose of this discussion, is to make sure that we're more clear about what the parameters are for the audiology aid designation.
Because staff have used a measure of invasiveness, and ear mold impressions would be extremely invasive, and they haven't gone through an examination for it. So I don't think anyone's been, to my knowledge, they're not approving people to do ear mold impressions right now. The question of what you do once you're registered, because we only see you at the beginning, right? So you register with us, you're brand new, you're getting training. Without a renewal requirement and requirement that the supervisor tell us often, and with some sort of piece there to say you have to tell us what's going on, how has it changed, what is the tasks that have changed over time due to the training. We kind of don't really get a measure of that. I know we ask for it right now, but there isn't a, if you don't give it to us, stick there, you know what I mean?
Can I ask, Sharice, part of the reason this arose currently had to do with applications being backed up because there were issues on them that suggested activities that may be outside the scope. And wasn't that true, that there were some supervisors who were asking?
They are asking for them to do it, yes.
Maybe it wasn't ear impressions, but something else?
There was some others holding the patients. I think one had ear mold impressions on it, and a couple other tasks that seemed a little too invasive, and so those were kind of the question areas. A lot of, and I'm going to say, is we are seeing more where they're saying, oh, but I'm hiring somebody who has education and experience in doing certain things, so I want them to do more. So that kind of begs the question of, we don't have a space, we don't have a structure for that, we don't have the immediate direct and indirect supervision for aides. It's all kind of amorphous. So approval is essentially approval. Go forth and you said the tasks and it's okay. So
if you look at the list of potentially acceptable tasks on page 1 of 2 in attachment G, there are a number of activities that are definitely acceptable in my view for an audiology aide to do. Then it drifts down into more complex tasks that require, I would say, more supervision and or more training. They get a little, more challenging in terms of accepting doing this. And when you look over at potentially prohibited tasks, they're a little bit vague. The audiology assistant is not qualified to do. And who judges that?
And that would be the problem for the board. It's going to have to be some sort of measure that the supervisor is certifying something there. Staff is not really trained on how to know that. So we don't have a structure currently. And that's where it gets a little difficult. We don't have, where is it?
Sharice, can you tell us the origins of the list? Is this the list that was put together by previous boards or committees? in the
This
past?
list started previously with the board many years ago, and then I think Dr. Raggio took a look at it. This is also in looking at different lists by ASHA of what's allowed for their audiology assistants. So I think it's taking in a lot of different areas and then trying to use our best judgment. This is not something that's been implemented, so this is definitely still something that is a potential.
So that's an important point of clarity. This isn't a recommendation. This is just kind of, for example, this is what something could look like. Because we even use the term audiology assistant in the document, and I think that's because it came from an audiology assistant type document. But this is really just something for us to
and board staff wanted to have a list so that you guys, those that aren't actually out there as audiologists with assistants might see some of the tasks that they're talking about or that out there. So I think it was at least helpful in enlightening us on that. Not that we're saying please adopt it and let's go.
But we don't need new regulations to be able to develop a list. It's already in regulation that the board can do that. Is that correct?
The board doesn't have a list in regulations right now.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah.
But the ability to create one.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't need new regulations in order to do that. That's my point.
Well, just chiming in, if we're going to adopt standards and tasks that aides can perform or not perform, that would be a rule of general applicability, and we would need to do that in regulation.
Yeah. And that's where it begs the other question. So currently, the statute authorizes the board to designate requirements related to the extent, kind, and quality of services performed by the aide. And so then you could consider, are there any sort of minimum requirements, any training requirements that might relate to the extent or kind of services that an audiology aide is allowed to do, and then we would define them in regulation. Currently, 1399.154.4 requires aides to complete a training program established by the supervisor prior to being allowed to assist in the practice of audiology. We could start clarifying some of those requirements and also explaining what sort of amount of training is required for certain tasks. I think that would be something that you could go through as well. And that's where, rather than putting a list into the regulations, it seemed more that we might want to talk about categories of activities or categories of tasks, and that, these are allowed. You obviously have to train your aide, but maybe there are slightly more complex activities that don't require a license in order to do them, that after a certain amount of immediate training or over-the-shoulder training, your aide can do. And it'd be up to the supervisor to certify that and make sure that they're doing that before they start commencing those activities. We just don't spell any of that out currently. So there is that opportunity to spell that out. If we're not, you could always just make a list if you really, really want to. There's just always difficulties with making lists like this. So I was trying to think about how we could talk about these things. There is the prohibited side, you can't do certain things. There's types of activities and categories. You're not going to perform tympanometry. You're not going to do certain things like that. You can't do something to diagnose someone. But maybe the activities can be set up so that the easier ones, so the, greeting and escorting patients, scheduling, conducting inventories, performing checks. A lot of those are things you can do much closer out of the gate without as much training as the other ones, where you get into preparing the materials for ear impression and performing equipment maintenance and performing pure tone hearing screenings without interpretation. And so if we get a little more defined on how that works, does that actually help us?
How do we, in terms of data collection, is it possible to audit the plans that have been approved and to see what tasks audiologists are asking their aides to be utilized for, so that we could see what maybe the scope or the breadth of that is? Is it really truly very wide, and some of these plans have gotten through in the last 8-10 years and they are very different than what maybe is being approved now? Or has there been very has it been very consistent in let's say in a 10-year period for what types of plans or activities have been approved versus not, or is there a way to audit that and kind of pull all that together so we could
take it into consideration? Absolutely, just like we looked at the not approved, the denied CE courses for hearing aid dispensers, we can take a look.
I guess because I'm concerned that, you know, if we, because it was rather broad, or is very broad right now, and then we decide to narrow it down because that makes sense maybe to do, just what the impact of that would be on those that are already operating with their aid, and how that would affect operations of those audiologists.
And I would suggest that I don't know about consistency prior to myself. So,
sure, of course.
Yeah, I think we have a team that is very cognizant and very detailed, but I would not be able to say 10 years ago it was the same folks, or even if it was the same kind of aids people were looking to register. Now, I mean, that's the thing with the national trend, right? They're seeing something else out there. They've finished this amount of degree. They've done some on-the-job training.
Well, and because we don't require any check back. I mean, there's no check back in to see what they are doing, or an update to their plan, you know, as to what activities they've taken on since before, you know, they were new, and now it's 5 years later, have they gained additional activities, and we just haven't notified the board of that,
or have they just left the field?
Yeah.
Right.
Would it be a legitimate approach to only list what they can do? And thus, we don't have to list what they can't do.
You could. That is one route you can go. I would point out that it can be rather restrictive, and you are limiting it and just understanding how long regs take. Amending that to add new things that are similar or like but not named could be problematic in the future. So oftentimes that's why.
Well, I mean, even in categories.
The categories, I think, would be more easily understandable and implemented. So if it's a like activity in a category, then that would be simple enough, right?
Without saying categories of what they can't do.
You
could. Is
there
any value to that?
The question you might run into is, right now the statute is pretty broad, so you may want to clarify that there are things that they can't do.
Or clarify supervision.
You could clarify supervision, and I just don't know if that would automatically write out some of the things we hear that people are doing that they maybe shouldn't be. That they maybe took that statute a little too far, that they can do anything under the supervision of the audiologist.
But we can very easily make determinations as to educational requirements or specific training requirements.
I'm going to pause on educational requirements just because the aid registration and statute doesn't seem like it lends itself to an educational requirement as much as it might a experience and training requirement, because that leads you to, let's see, when we're talking extent in kind and developing standards for that, that seems to be within the board's statutes. That's kind of referenced as determining that, those kind of requirements. Normally in our statute, if you're going to implement educational requirements, it's talked about also in the statute. So the SLIPA has educational requirements in the statute, as where we have minimum registration requirements, which I could be wrong, as I'm definitely not the lawyer, or any lawyer, that it doesn't seem to be in the same way that all of our other statutes that allow for educational requirements to be determined by the board, where it's not specific in the statute. So SLIPAs, it does talk about requiring a degree, and that the board will develop regulations to determine the rest of it. AIDS, it's just establish minimum requirements for the registration.
So is requiring any specific training program akin to requiring education? So it's not a degree, but it's a training program that exists?
I think training program tends to go more towards the fact that the statute says the board can determine standards, where is it at? Standards related to the extent, kind, and quality of services performed by the aid. So when you get into that, you're saying the board has these standards for supervision, and that determines kind of the extent and kinds of services. Could be.
Therese is covering this very well, but let me just chime in to say that anytime aids are used generally in the business and professions area of the codes, we're talking about unlicensed persons. So generally to have a requirement for an educational requirement, we'd be talking about a new license type.
Any formal training is all the same. It's all under that umbrella of education.
Correct.
Okay.
I mean, the legislature could adopt a statute and say, in order to identify yourself as an audiology aid, you have to have this education. But really that walks us into the area where now we're talking about a license. Rather than just an aide who is a layperson that has some training requirements, who may need to register with the board, but is not seeking a specific education and then being tested, being issued a license.
So, I mean, I think in theory, an aide is an excellent option, right? As a provider, to have an aide be able to help you see more patients and do the types of patient care that maybe don't require your professional knowledge and skills. But it's confusing when you're out there practicing because you're working in hospitals or ENT clinics, for example, that they call them ototechs, right? So it's like an aid that a medical doctor uses, and they because they're on the medical doctor's license, they can do all the things the audiologist does. They can do hearing tests, they can do balance exams, they do all sorts of testing, you know, and we're working right alongside them as an audiologist. So then when you're in a situation where, well, I could have an audiology aid, well, the medical doctor aide with no specific training gets to do everything the audiologist can do. So wouldn't I, as an audiologist, allow my aide to do those things too? And I think that's where the confusion comes in from the public, from the audiologist, you know, out in the field. It's very confusing to look at other aides on other licenses that have the freedom to operate however that licensee sees fit, essentially, and have all of that freedom, whereas we aren't operating that same way over here. I'm not suggesting we should, but I think that's where it gets very confusing on what an aide really is for an audiologist.
That's always been the issue, though, for as long as I've been on the board.
Yeah.
Physicians can hire their front office staff to do tympanometry, and there's nothing it appears we can do about that.
Right.
That's always been the way it is.
So I think the question is, how functional is an aid for an audiologist if we're not going to require an educational requirement? Is it really that functional? Is it really safe? You know, do we really want aides out there doing some of these activities that it sure would be useful to have them do, but maybe is not the best idea because there's not an education? So I think having a trajectory, you know, in mind is important.
That reminds me of something. I was just curious. There is at least one, if not more, audiology assistant educational programs in California. CSU LA has one. I don't know what happens to those people once they have to take 30 units and do a lot of stuff. It's like a year program. They don't have any other different classification than an aide, right? They're not becoming an audiologist.
And that's technically all they can be registered as, is an audiology aide.
So I wonder.
I can tell you that we've seen job postings about assistants that there is no such assistant category, and the job title does not reference any requirement to be registered as an aide with us either. So there is that other what's going on in the field problem. So
would it be reasonable for us to ask that the Audiology Practice Committee try to develop some sort of categorical activities that can be done with perhaps some supervisory language, if that's appropriate, to bring back to the full board? Perhaps not by tomorrow, but, you know.
I figured this might be a long conversation. I think the statute very clearly in 2530.6 is going to tell us that The supervising audiologist or speech-language pathologist, because it's both in this one, shall be responsible for the extent, kind, and quality of services performed by the aide, but it has a comma and a contingency there that says consistent with the board's designated standards and requirements. So I think if we're going to focus on that and we focus on the standards, the supervision, and making sure the training that is required of them is appropriate, then I think that firms this up. And then I think that really does help the licensed community. It does keep kind of in check the safety concerns. And, you know, in the future, when the conversation comes up about assistance, if the aid is a clear category, then it'll be that much easier when we're looking in the future.
What was that code again?
2530.6, page 9 of your book, if you have your blue book in front of you.
Mm-hmm. So if we have that purview, then would it be appropriate then to have the Audiology Practice Committee take a stab at coming up with some language that, or some categorization?
I think it would be helpful. I think at least if we can start building something for the committee to look at and talk about and flesh out with the regulated community here, that would be great. And I feel like once we start putting more on the paper for more to discuss, then it'll get easier to put those categories together, I think.
Okay, so any further discussion about it?
I think the other item I just want to point out is there is a variety of ways to define things. You don't have to use the SLPA supervision concept. The idea is just really to, if we nail down supervision aspects, does that help us along with these issues to determine those standards for supervision and what should require the audiologist to be in the room on site, what's allowed when they're not on site, those kind of considerations with consumer safety in mind. So,
do you envision that if we had an audiology assistant license type, that we would still have audiology aides?
I'm going to tell you we currently still have speech-language pathology aides, and we get a handful of applications per year, so we do still get those. I think the one thing to think about is workforce development-wise, right? There's going to be a lot of people that get a certain amount of education, and having them as an aide keeps them at that lower level, but if they have the education, this is an opportunity. It's a workforce development opportunity as well. It's an opportunity to use that education and experience. What you'll find with speech-language pathology is there's always still people that aren't able to get the speech-language pathology assistant associates or bachelors and the field work, and so you do see people that end up in the aid category still. So that is one of the difficulties, and of course, as we noted in our sunset, the legislature is very particular on the idea of taking something away. So if there are still people coming into the category because they can't meet the bar of assistant, then there's that space still, and how do you, they call it, how do you offboard or how do you give them a ramp to the assistant category if you're going to get rid of it altogether? Mm-hmm. And as where it might be a different conversation for the legislature, if no one ever applied for a speech-language pathology aid in the last 10 years, then maybe it's a different conversation, but we still do have that. So,
okay, thank you.
And we do get people that call all the time looking for how to get into a field work program, how to do certain things, so.
Okay, so I would like to propose, not quite make a motion, but I'm thinking out loud that not only should the Audiology Practice Committee perhaps work on this, but with board staff along with this, because you know just a ton of things that would be helpful to us to develop that. So is that a legitimate motion that we could entertain?
Yeah. Would the committee like to designate one of the members of the committee to work with the staff? And
does it have to be one person?
I think it can be up to 2, just like we've done before.
Okay, so that's, okay.
But correct me if I'm wrong, Michael. You're good.
That is correct.
Okay, up to 2.
It could be more, but then you would have to have noticed public meetings.
Okay, so does anyone want to make that motion?
a motion to have, was it an ad hoc committee at that point? It's not a committee. It's just to ask board staff to work with someone from the Audiology Practices Committee or 2 members of the Audiology Practices Committee to come up with some language and guidelines regarding the audiology aid.
I second.
Okay. I'm really interested in opening it up to public comment at this point to see what the feeling is out there. So I know Sharice has some public information, but we can also open.
And before we open it up to Webex, I'm going to go ahead and read the written public comment we received, and this is from a Debbie Clark, Pacific Hearing Service in Los Altos, and she thanks all of you for being on the board, and she's very grateful for the work that you do. She thanks you for taking up the issue of audiology assistants. It's a topic that is top of mind for our audiology practice, and they would like to make the following comments. And it goes, with the shortage of audiologists in the Bay Area, clinics and private practices are stretched thin, and we depend on our audiology assistants to help us provide excellent care and follow-up for our patients. Of particular concern to us is the fact that audiology assistants are not able to perform otoscopic checks for wax. We would like to explain why this would be helpful to us and believe to most practices, and how this could be done with strong consideration to safety of the patient. Why so often patients arrive in the clinic with very dirty hearing aids or hearing complaints they believe to be due to a malfunctioning hearing aid. We see the ability for the assistant to inspect the ear canal as triage and not diagnostic. We believe most audiology clinics would benefit from having an audiology assistant available who could inspect the ear canal using an otoscope and determine if the next step is to make an appointment for wax removal, a hearing test, or investigating the need for hearing aid repair. Safety. We agree that if audiology assistants take on this responsibility, it should only be done after proper and thorough training. In this day and age, when patients can purchase otoscopy cameras on Amazon and essentially look into their own ears, we feel it is in the best interest to have someone who has at a minimum been trained to inspect for occlusion of the ear. In addition, they could look for domes and wax guards that often end up in the patient's ear canal. Finally, we believe that having direct supervision at all times is not helpful to the clinic or audiology practice. We are seeking clarity on what the assistants can do independently. For example, we believe they can teach a patient to insert their hearing aids, teach the patient regarding basic use and care of the instruments, help them with accessories and smartphone compatibility, and otoscopic checks. Thank you so much for your considering our comments. We can go to the Webex now.
All right, we are accepting public comment through Webex. If you would like to make a comment, please type the word comment through the Q&A box in the lower right-hand corner of your screen and send that comment to all participants. If you are a dial-in user, please dial *3 to raise your hand, and we will call on people in the order we have requests for comments. And our first request comes from Deborah Clark. Bear with us just a moment, and we will send you a request to unmute your microphone.
Great. Am I unmuted now?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Okay, great, thanks. Well, I don't have much left to say since you just read my letter, and thank you so much for that. So the only thing I will add is that I would love to provide input to the committee. So when you do put together your committee, I think our practice would love to be asked our opinions on audiology assistants. So that's all I have to say for now. Thank you, and thanks again for reading my comments.
And next on the list, we have Christy Kursich. Help me if I mispronounce that. Bear with us just a moment, and we're sending you a request to unmute your microphone. All right, Christy, I saw that you unmuted and then remuted. Let's try again.
There. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm Christy Kirsch. I'm the clinic director from San Diego State University. First, I'd just like to thank you for discussing this topic. I have a couple things. I do think that both categories, aid and assistant, would continue to be used. I get confused in terms of which one is the aid and which is the assistant, but I can imagine front desk staff using people in the less trained category, and those sites also perhaps hiring a more trained assistant to help. We're a training institution, and the reason that I'm really interested in this is we're trying to make sure that our students understand the proper use of aides or assistants in the clinic. I want to make sure I'm teaching them correctly. I want to make sure that we're using hours correctly. So I'm really looking for clear guidelines in terms of what duties they are able to perform and what is the definition of direct supervision. So I want to thank you for taking this topic up, especially with the changing landscape of hearing aid delivery. And I want to follow, I'm interested in following what you do, but most I want to thank you because I think this is a really, really pertinent topic that we need to address for audiologists across the state.
All right, thank you very much. And that appears to be the entirety of our request for comments for Webex. Would you like to move to Ms. Dominguez?
Sure.
There is no one present with me for public comment.
Okay, thank you. Is there any further discussion from the committee members? I was somewhat intrigued by the notion of triage. It sounds like an interesting way to go. I suspect that there is some interpretation that goes with triage. And while it feels better than just jumping in there and doing that, and rather just delegating, what do you think? Is it, it still would require some interpretation?
I am not an audiologist, but most licensed professionals, such as registered nurses that do triage, have a certain amount of training on implementing those criteria for patients. I have also heard, I think it was at a previous board meeting, someone asked about using potentially video otoscopy so that the aide is looking at the ear, taking a snapshot, and then the audiologist is saying yes, no, maybe so. I mean, I don't mean to say it like that. It's obviously a more important determination, but that is kind of the idea there. So, of course, not being the audiologist, it begs the question. I think it's something you guys should look at. I think you should think about the ways in which untrained people should be doing those things and what level of supervision, maybe what level of training. Definitely defer to you guys.
Kind of an interesting middle ground, perhaps. I mean, they're only asking about triaging for that purpose. Mm-hmm. Could that be extended to other more involved issues? Don't know. Cool. Anyway, any other discussion among the committee members about it? Okay, so we have a motion and a second on the floor. I'd like to call for the vote.
Dr. Baggio?
Aye.
Ms. Chang?
Aye.
Dr. White?
Aye. Motion carries. Okay, moving on to discussion item 4, update, discussion, and possible action regarding audiology licensing requirements related to supervised clinical and professional experience as stated in BMP Code Sections 2532.2 and 2532.25 and Title 16 CCR Section 1399.152.2. Sharice, I have you as the
Paul and I wanted to provide the committee with an update. So originally, part of our plan was if it was already in the sunset, let's go ahead and start hammering out the language that we want in the regulation. As it currently stands, the changing the statute to allow pre-didactic hours to count is not in the statute, and we are not sure what it will look like. So we just wanted to provide the update that it still seems little preemptive right now. We don't know if they'll go one way or another with that statutory change. We do not have a no-go. It's not a no-go yet. We're still in discussions with the Sunset Committee on how to get the provisions and what they're comfortable with. And so it might behoove us to have our meeting in August when we have the next board meeting, to have another Audiology Committee meeting to start working on those regs. So hopefully we'll know by then, are we getting to use pre-didactic? Are they willing to move away from 12 months? Maybe they're only willing to accept hours, the 1,850 hours that are equivalent to the 12 months. We just aren't quite sure we're on strong footing to start working on a regulation at this moment. So that we wanted to provide that update. We wanted everyone to know we're still working on it. You'll see in the bill tomorrow it's not in there. So, but that it also seemed a little preemptive to start hammering out language related to, can you use the those clinical rotation hours towards your RPE before the Sunset Committee is willing to put it into a bill, and the recourse to that. So if they are not, and we don't get the provisions we are looking at, we would run a bill next year. So that would be the discussion then, is how to address those statutory changes on our own solo, not as part of a committee bill.
I just want to clarify what you're saying. Is the consultant suggesting that we could put that language in the current sunset bill, and those regulatory specifics that we were going to put in regulatory language following the sunset legislation, they would accept it better if it were all incorporated?
No. That's
not the case?
I think we're still stuck on not wanting to reduce to 12 months, and if so, to go to an hours. And they seem concerned about allowing those clinical rotation hours towards those hours.
What's the concern?
I think the lowering of the standard there, and that those are different, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Paul, but that those are different hours and you already have that as a separate hours.
Yeah, I don't know if I would even identify it so much as concern as I think that the committee staff are just trying to really understand what the requirements are and what we're trying to propose. And there have been a lot of really good questions when it comes to, you know, why the need for the post-didactic requirement, and how much would we reduce the requirement for months? Why not just go for just hours? So there have been a lot of discussion. I think we're still kind of just really trying to make sure everyone understands.
Yeah.
So hopefully we'll know more in the next few weeks.
Yeah. We just wanted to provide the update, though, in the meantime, that, you know, I know we had hoped to be working on this by now. So an update, it's in the process. We're still trying to get the changes that we requested. And
well, we appreciate that. I'm just wondering if, I think there's some pretty compelling arguments for making regulatory language that restricts the use of pre-didactic rotations that are 100% supervised, that doesn't make it feel as though it's somehow lesser than if they receive that training. And if we had, in fact, you had come up with some suggested percentages of hours that could be used from that. That's all been explained to them. They understand that ASHA's requirement says, not hours, it says 12 months. So the time element is important to some people. Not a lot of us, but some people do care about that.
Yeah.
And they're not probably going to change their mind for California.
We'll see. I think it's actually rather encouraging that they're this engaged and want to know this many details about the field accreditation and program requirements, and it's great that we did all the work we did in 2020 to ask the graduate programs all this information and be able to provide that sort of information so that they aren't thinking that they're only getting a couple hundred hours of clinical rotation. No, it's multiple hundreds of hours, and that they're getting a lot of really good training throughout the program, and then understanding what other states require. So I think they're asking good questions, and we are hopeful. It's just, it seemed a little preemptive to go ahead and let's do some language based on statutory language that may or may not look like what we've asked for. So
that makes sense.
But we didn't want you to think we weren't working on it at the same time. So just wanted to provide an update.
We had developed or worked on a survey to try to ask the AD programs out there what their rotations look like, what kind of supervision they had. Can you address where things stand with that?
We're in the middle of looking at those, addressing kind of multiple choice answers for them, as well as open-ended questions for them. And then hopefully within the next month or so, I'll be getting it ready,